I'm Anna Runkle, also known as the Crappy Childhood Fairy, and in this video I'm going to cover 4 ideas that you and all of us were told about how childhood trauma affects us in adulthood and how they used to think recovery should happen. These ideas have dominated the way that childhood trauma has been viewed for decades, but it turns out, and this is good news, that they're just not true. Now, I say this is good news because so many of us, myself included, spent years of our lives trying to get help for trauma-related symptoms and getting too little improvement or no improvement at all. We didn't even know that a lot of our struggles were trauma-related. We didn't know what was wrong with us. And when we tried the methods that seemed to work so well for other people, things like therapy, medication, groups, books, exercises, all that stuff, they didn't help. Or they didn't seem to help us. Not really. And now we know why. Now, many people, including some therapists and doctors, are still bought into those old ideas about trauma. But I'm going to tell you a new approach based on new research and my own experience recovering from childhood trauma and teaching others how to recover too. And if you think that you're still affected by abuse and neglect that happened in your childhood, and especially if conventional therapy and other treatments for childhood PTSD haven't been that helpful for you, this information could be really important and, I hope, liberating for you to know. So here's what I'm going to cover in this webinar. I'm going to give a quick overview of what we know about CPTSD. Then I'll get into the first myth, which has to do with the old understanding versus the truth about what drives most CPTSD symptoms. I'll talk about the kinds of trauma that can linger throughout your lifetime, how to recognize symptoms, and I'll show you the big picture about all the ways that early trauma might still be affecting you. And some of it might explain a lot about what you've experienced, but maybe you had no idea where it was coming from. So then I'll get into the myths about treatment, what doesn't work and what does work. And I know that's the most important thing for you to know, so let's dive in. I want to give you a little 101 about the terms PTSD, CPTSD, and childhood PTSD, because you'll hear me use these terms a lot. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is a real diagnosis. Usually it's applied to cases where people had a traumatic event happen in adulthood, like taking part in a battle or having a car accident. And the symptoms can include things like flashbacks, anxiety, depression, insomnia, withdrawing from people, or exploding emotionally sometimes. And another kind of PTSD is complex PTSD, or CPTSD. And this is caused by chronic, ongoing exposure to emotional or physical trauma, which would be things like living through a war, being in an abusive relationship for a long time, or growing up neglected or abused. And it's this kind of CPTSD that I call childhood PTSD, and it's what my work is all about. I grew up in a family where most of the adults were alcoholic, and we had a lot of problems that tend to go with that. We were poor, there was a lot of violence in the house, and we kids didn't always get the care and attention that we needed just to be okay and to stay safe. Now, I talk more about my story and how I recovered in my online courses and on my website and YouTube channel, and I teach all about childhood trauma there, so that's there if you want to check it out. But right here in this webinar, we're going to talk about 4 myths that might be blocking you and your healing. So let's jump right in. Okay, so myth number 1 is the old belief that the adult effects of early trauma are fundamentally psychological. What we now know is that a significant part of the problem, maybe most of the problem, is in fact neurological, meaning trauma has injured or disrupted the brain and nervous system. Now, this is a completely different ballgame than what everyone used to believe, and it has profound implications about symptoms and about treatment, and why so many people seem to get stuck in self-defeating behaviors that make it seem from the outside like so many of us are like trying to screw up our lives. We're not. It's neurological. So how do we know this? Short history lesson. Complex PTSD, or childhood PTSD, tends to follow a common pattern of symptoms. And this is a huge area of research now, and that's good. And the biggest and most impactful research program so far is probably the ACE study, which has become an accepted, though maybe kind of imperfect way to measure the scope of a person's early trauma and then predict how it might affect them throughout their life. So the ACE study began in the mid-90s when Vincent Felitti of Kaiser Permanente and Robert Anda of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control interviewed hundreds of study participants about their history of what they called adverse childhood experiences, ACE, right? ACE. And they created a survey with 10 questions about bad things that might have happened to you when you were a kid. You got 1 point for each question where you answered yes, and so your score would be somewhere between 0 for none of them and 10 for all of them. The questions have to do with physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, seeing your mother treated violently. Was there household substance abuse? Was there household mental illness? Was there parental separation or divorce? And was someone in your household incarcerated? Now, as you're probably already thinking, there are dozens of experiences that could have been included, like seeing your father abused, or the death of a parent, or being bullied in school, or being desperately poor, or living as a refugee, or being subjected to racism on a chronic or systemic basis. And you can take these things into consideration if you decide to take the test. But the researchers found that the higher your ACE score, the higher the probability that you'll experience certain problems in your life. And these include problems that you would expect to see just as common sense with trauma, right? Like depression, anxiety, addictions, smoking, eating disorders, violent behavior, or being in a violent relationship. But the study also showed some surprises. Higher ACE scores increased the likelihood of cognitive difficulties, including ADHD, memory problems, learning disabilities. Also, things they never thought were connected, things like heart disease, obesity, diabetes, migraines, thyroid disorders, chronic fatigue, rheumatoid arthritis, reproductive disorders like endometriosis or pelvic inflammatory disease, gastrointestinal disorders, fibromyalgia and chronic pain, chronic lung disease and stroke. It's just an incredibly long list. But this was big news, that trauma in childhood can play a significant role in not just behavioral, but physiological problems in adults. And what this means is that learning to heal childhood PTSD is one of the most life-changing things that we can do as people and as a society. But it begs the question, what is the mechanism for trauma to affect all these body systems? So, okay, first, let's get a working definition of trauma. Trauma is what we experienced as kids when the bad things were happening. When you're a baby or a small child, trauma is especially toxic for your brain, and it can cause developmental changes. Now, believe it or not, being neglected can be even worse for your brain than being abused. Now, for healthy brain development, a child needs the parent to be connected to them, to make eye contact, talk to them, and to respond to their feelings and their accomplishments. Now, if parents are dead, gone, drunk, high, obsessed with a boyfriend, depressed, or just otherwise not paying attention, the child may learn to dissociate. It kind of means to check out in a big way. Or they might have periods of dysregulation in the emotions, the brain, and the nervous system. And this is where we make the connection to the neurological effects of trauma. And I'm going to go deeper into this. But it's not all in your mind. Okay? It turns out it's in your brain. So the traumatized child who is dealing with what amounts to a neurological injury from abuse and neglect that's been taking place over time, that child might struggle with common childhood symptoms of trauma, things like connecting with people, sitting still and paying attention, controlling impulses, and, of course, learning. And as they grow to adulthood, even more problems and more serious problems start to show up. So I gave you a long list of adult signs of trauma, but there are two that particularly mark CPTSD, and those are emotional flashbacks and dysregulation. Now, emotional flashbacks involve really strong negative emotions that come on suddenly, and they don't seem on the surface connected to anything happening in present time. So like a person will suddenly be flooded, and that's what it's actually called, flooding, with an overwhelming sense of sadness or rage or terror or frustration or all those feelings at once. And it can happen when you wake up, for example, or when someone criticizes you, or even just when someone gives you a present, because even something positive can be a trigger. Now, you're not reliving some childhood experience consciously. You know that you're here in present time, but the emotions don't seem to know it, and you're reacting like you did during the original trauma. Now, the second specific symptom, and I mentioned it briefly before, is a tendency to become dysregulated, emotionally and neurologically. So let's talk more about that and what we mean by the word dysregulation. You may not know the word yet, but you probably know the feeling. So everyone gets dysregulated sometimes, and most of us eventually re-regulate. But people with childhood PTSD may spend more time in a dysregulated state than other people and have more difficulty re-regulating. You might feel numbness in your hands or your face or your mouth, or get lost while you're driving, or find yourself unable to finish a sentence. Now, dysregulation can also lead to getting sick, to having trouble focusing, to having emotional outbursts, and either the feelings are too much or they barely exist, they're very flat. And the same person might go back and forth between those two extremes. When you're dysregulated, part of your brain is actually shut down, which I'll explain in a minute. And this is likely an old response to unbearable stress when your brain was developing. Without your full brain working, you are not fully yourself. So your perception is off. You say things you don't really mean, and they might seem like you mean it in the moment, but only because you're operating with half a brain. What people who had a rough childhood often go through life feeling, well, knowing really, is that they're a little different than most people. And maybe we are a little different. Just being dysregulated is a problem that makes ordinary things in life ridiculously hard. Things like going on a date, spending time alone, or expressing an opinion, or just buying a pair of shoes can set it off. This is the piece that was not well understood until very recently. But if you could see an MRI image of the brain in this dysregulated state, you'd see the front left cortex go dim and inactive, and that's hampering the ability to reason and pay attention. And you'd see the right front cortex flaring up, and that is a flood of emotions. So suppressed reasoning, overactive emotions. Is that familiar? This is what we call a trigger. And this sets off a change in the nervous system. You might feel adrenaline or feel like a chemical reaction is just spreading through your body. Or it might not really feel like anything. But with dysregulation, your brain waves become irregular. Your breathing and heart rate get ragged and out of sync. And then come the symptoms I described a minute ago: emotional outbursts, numbness, loss of focus, trouble finishing thoughts. And it can be impossible to finish something that you're working on. And it can be hard to just pay attention. You're ruminating about something you remember while you're trying to pay attention to something right in front of you. And this is like when you're reading the same paragraph over and over, but you keep spacing out and you can't remember what you just read. Do you have that? Personally, when I'm dysregulated, I get clumsy and I trip over my feet and I drop things. I once broke 4 different dishes at different times in the same day. One way that I know I'm dysregulated is my handwriting changes. It's like that deep in my brain. Now, you might have called dysregulation feeling discombobulated or out of your body, or you joked that you were having a senior moment, right? Is it starting to make sense and connect with your experience now? So dysregulation can also spread into your thinking and what you're feeling. And for a lot of us, we get dark thoughts. And this is where we're really at risk for saying harsh things or doing things we don't want to do. Offending people, hurting our relationships, or maybe getting silent and withdrawn at exactly the wrong moment. Or we may feel desperate and act out impulsively or lash out at people in anger. And these symptoms might seem like they're just behavioral issues, but you can see now how they begin with dysregulation up here. And then after an outburst, a lot of us have a phase of not feeling or not being able to show feelings. They're like shoved way tightly down. And in this state, we sometimes behave coldly to the people we just offended. A friend of mine once told me that when I was upset, I had a blank expression on my face. And so it was impossible to tell from the outside what I was feeling, because When I'm very upset, what it looks like I'm feeling is nothing. Does that ever happen to you? So here's the thing. These reactions are not happening because I'm bad or you're bad or anybody else is bad or selfish or weak. And I mean, we all have a little bit of that, right? But these reactions happen in us, or they're made worse, because the brain is dysregulated. Nobody knew this before. Not doctors, not therapists, not preschool teachers. Nobody knew. And they judged us. But now we know. Dysregulation gets activated when we're confronted with stressors and crises. And remember, it can suppress your ability to reason while at the same time amping up your emotions. So this could explain why so many of us appear to just keep making the same bad choices over and over, even when we say we're never going to do it again, even when we mean we're never going to do it again, but then you look down and there you are just doing it again. So I'm here to tell you, you can break this cycle. You really are capable of making good choices and good changes, but not until you learn to re-regulate. So this brings me to the second myth. So let's say that you've learned to re-regulate. Then what happens? How do you keep your healing going? Well, the first thing most people would think of is go to therapy. And in therapy, you're very likely going to be guided to spend a lot of time focusing on what happened to you. But that approach is based on the myth that the past is where the problem is and that focusing on the past is where all the healing lies. You might be someone where that is just not how it works. The fact is, focusing on your childhood traumas will not by itself produce recovery. Now, of course, taking stock of what happened is a useful first step, but very soon in the process, it's important to look at what's happening, not just in the past, but now. What symptoms are you having? What are you doing that might be re-traumatizing you? What can you do to calm your triggers and bypass that trauma reaction that just keeps getting in your way? This is one of the reasons that talk therapy doesn't often work well for trauma and why other methods of recovery could be necessary. Okay, the third myth is that exploring memories and feeling feelings is the goal of the healing process. And again, memories and feelings are important and they have a place in your recovery, but they're not the goal. And if you focus too much on memories and feelings, you can end up sadder and more dysregulated than you were when you started. Now, the problem is not so much the memories, but the unregulated reactions that they trigger. So feeling feelings is good, but to heal, we've got to learn to regulate those feelings, to have more influence over our nervous system reactions. And that is what makes change possible. Now, one of the big problems is that in these hyper-emotional states, we are prone to and even crave destructive behaviors. Now, why we do that is another story. I teach that in other courses. But the sooner we can recognize that this is happening, the sooner we can interrupt the overload. We can do this with quick interventions like stepping away, not speaking in that moment, taking deep breaths, writing, exercising, or counting to 10. And at the end of this video, I'll give you the opportunity to download a list of emergency measures that you can take to re-regulate. That is a lot of what I teach in my courses. But let's talk about the fourth myth. And this one's pretty intense. You were probably told that if you had abuse and trauma in your childhood, you needed to talk about it, right? And if you tried talking about it with a therapist or friend, maybe it felt good to get it off your chest, or maybe you're like me and talking about past hurts actually feels upsetting, like never a relief, just upsetting. Now, talking can be good, and at some point telling your story is definitely going to be essential, but for people who get dysregulated, talking as the primary mode of therapy can turn a stressful inner state into a completely dysregulated state. Like all systems are broken. You can't think clearly. You can't hear straight. You can't make decisions. You can't remember what was discussed. And this is why talk therapy does not work so well for so many of us. I can't tell you the years of therapy I had with different therapists, good therapists, who would all eventually in sessions with me get that same weird look on their face like, because once again, I had grown progressively more checked out and blabby and irritable and just started to go nowhere in that very circular and expensive hour. And I was trying, but I never really improved from week to week. Now, this was before dysregulation was really understood. And even still, a lot of therapists now are in the dark about how common this is. But all that talking would just destroy me. And after every session before I could drive home, I had to go sit in my car and cry for like half an hour. And I'd wonder, what the hell is wrong with me? Everybody says therapy is so great, but I go and it only makes me feel worse. If you have that and you had a hard childhood, I have great news for you. That is common. It's really normal for people with complex PTSD to get dysregulated when we just jump in and start talking about traumatic memories. So what does help us? Instead of talking about it, we can write about it for one. Self-expression through writing uses a completely different part of the brain than talking. And that can enable you to bypass the out of control emotions that get triggered when you talk about something painful. And that's why I use writing every day in something I call the daily practice. And if you want to learn that, it's tucked into my course, which I'm going to show you at the end of this video. And thousands of people are loving it. Writing can calm your triggers and it can clear your mind for insight. And when you're steady and clear like that, then your most important strength can kick in, and that is action. Action and making strong decisions about your life are the most powerful ways to change your health, your thinking, and your behavior. Now, I know it is not easy. It's not all about just having a good attitude or even about just using some tools. And honestly, some of our problems are pretty big. For one thing, messed up families can pass on some pretty dysfunctional beliefs and habits. And trauma behavior can be kind of like a culture. And that's why we like hanging out with other traumatized people, and why, on the negative side, we can be so attractive to people who are screwed up. We get them, they get us. But when you're ready to recover, it's not even about those other people or your parents, and it's not about the past, because your past can't change and your family is unlikely to change. And it's not your fault. Please internalize that, okay? It's not your fault. But it's you and only you who can change your life. And everything now depends on your willingness to learn to re-regulate and take action. So when I learned all of this some years back, it gave me a framework to improve my own approach to healing. And my healing back then, it was kind of bumbling along, some progress here, some problems over there. But my whole life changed when these 4 puzzle pieces fell into place. The 4 truths that replace the myths. Just learning what is actually true. Number 1, that healing childhood PTSD is largely neurological. So we start by learning to re-regulate. Number 2, that focusing on traumas in the past will not by itself heal you. Number 3, the biggest opportunity for healing childhood PTSD lies in strengthening the way we react to life and the way we make choices right now. And number 4, instead of talking about the past, you can process your trauma by writing about it, and most of all, by taking action. And this is how you bypass the old triggers and stay more clear-headed about what's really happening and what you're going to need to do to actually change your health, your thinking, and your life. So when you know the truth, this is what healing boils down to. You learn to notice the dysregulation and re-regulate as quickly as possible. And then you work on the negative behaviors and circumstances that piled up in your life while you were dysregulated. And I know it's not easy, but I also know it's doable. It takes a lot of honesty and it takes practice. And there are so many ways that you could just give up and fall back into the old patterns. And in that state, we all just risk re-traumatizing and re-traumatizing ourselves. And when that happens, it's not just a disaster for us, but it's a loss for the whole world, because there is so much potential that's been trapped in all of us because we didn't know and there was no one to help us. But now we know, and there's hope and good stuff we can do. I can show you how to do it. It's a set of techniques for re-regulation plus some common sense principles that you can rely on for big things or just to help you navigate all the little choices that come up from day to day. You'll need some support, and we have a community for that. This is a group that's walking the same path you are, step by step, into a new and calmer and happier and more fulfilled way of life. So that's the goal. Not just feeling better, although you will feel better, but becoming the person you were meant to be, your real self. So that's what I teach. And if you think what I've described here sounds like it could help you, I'd love to have you in my course, Healing Childhood PTSD. To get all the details, just click on the button below this video. You'll be able to see what's included in it, the worksheets, the community you'll be part of, the cost, and the weekly calls that you can join on Zoom. And you'll be able to see what other students have said about the course. You don't have to go by just what I say. It is an incredible group of people, and the healing that we're seeing there is so powerful to witness. So thank you. Thank you for watching this, and I hope to see you in the course and on some Zoom calls very soon.